For months, Russia has been testing the limits of Europe's eastern defenses. Drone incursions, airspace violations, electronic interference, attacks on commercial shipping, suspicious incidents around critical infrastructure. But something has changed. Romania and Moldova are no longer responding with words alone. The warnings, diplomatic protests, and expressions of concern that once followed every Russian provocation are increasingly being replaced by military action. And that raises a much bigger question. Has Russia pushed the countries surrounding the Black Sea to the point where the next incident could trigger a direct confrontation? The answer may depend on what happens next. Romania draws a harder line. One of the clearest examples has emerged in the Romanian-controlled waters of the Black Sea. Near the strategically important Neptune deep gas project, Romanian authorities discovered two drifting drones after a civilian vessel operating in the area spotted them. The discovery immediately triggered a security response. Romanian officials determined that the drones were Russian-designed Gerber-type systems. These relatively simple platforms, constructed largely from lightweight materials, are commonly associated with Russian attempts to overwhelm or confuse Ukrainian air defenses. Romania was not prepared to simply leave them floating in an area surrounding critical infrastructure. Explosive ordnance specialists from the Romanian naval forces were sent to the scene. The drones were ultimately neutralized in a controlled operation. On the surface, it may look like a relatively small incident. Strategically, however, it sends a very different message. Romania is signaling that unidentified Russian origin systems approaching sensitive infrastructure will not automatically be treated as something to observe from a distance. They can be physically removed. And if necessary, destroyed. That represents a significant evolution in Romania's posture. The incidents that changed Bucharest's calculations. Romania's tougher response did not happen overnight. The pressure had been building for months. A particularly serious incident occurred when a Russian Garand-type kamikaze drone struck a civilian building in Galați, injuring people and demonstrating just how easily the war in Ukraine could spill across Romania's borders. Then came another major development. Toward the end of July, Romanian F-16s were used to intercept Russian drones that had entered Romanian airspace. That was important for one reason above all others. Romania was no longer simply documenting violations. Its military aircraft were physically responding. For Bucharest, the calculation is becoming increasingly straightforward. Romania is a NATO member. It hosts important military infrastructure. It controls access to strategic Black Sea territory. And it is developing major energy assets that could reduce Europe's dependence on Russian energy. That makes Romanian airspace and infrastructure increasingly important targets from a strategic perspective. Why Neptune Deep matters. The Neptune Deep gas project is particularly significant. Once fully operational, it is expected to transform Romania's position in the European energy market and potentially make the country one of the European Union's most important natural gas producers. That means the project is not simply an energy development. It is also a geopolitical asset. Every cubic meter of Romanian gas reduces Europe's dependence on external suppliers. And in the context of the war in Ukraine, energy independence has become part of national security. This is why any Russian drone activity around such infrastructure immediately attracts attention. The concern is not necessarily that every drone represents a deliberate attempt to destroy the platform. The concern is what happens when repeated incidents begin occurring around strategically important assets. At some point, governments can no longer afford to assume that every violation is accidental. Moldova faces its own nightmare. While Romania has been tightening its military response, Moldova has been facing a different but equally dangerous problem. Russian drones have increasingly appeared over Moldovan territory as the war in Ukraine continues. On August 9, an explosion occurred near the village of Krokmaz in Moldova's Stefan Voda district. A Russian-linked drone or drone missile system struck an area near the village before detonating. Fragments were scattered across the surrounding area, damaging civilian property. Fortunately, there were no reported fatalities. But the psychological effect was enormous. For Moldovans, the message was clear. The war does not have to formally enter Moldova for the consequences to reach its population. Then came another incident. On August 10, a jet-powered Shahid-type drone approaching from the direction of Ukraine was detected inside Moldovan airspace. The aircraft flew at low altitude, creating another serious security alert. Moldovan authorities immediately condemned the incident. President Maia Sandu described the developments as another consequence of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, while government officials warned that Moldova's geographic position could no longer guarantee its safety. The government also recalled its ambassador in Moscow for consultations. That diplomatic move demonstrated just how seriously Chisinau was treating the situation. The Transnistria problem. But Moldova's vulnerability goes far beyond drones. For decades, the unresolved Transnistria conflict has provided Moscow with a strategic foothold inside Moldova. Russian forces remain in the region, officially associated with peacekeeping responsibilities and the protection of the enormous ammunition stockpile at Kobasna. Moscow's presence gives the Kremlin leverage over Moldova. It also creates a permanent security problem for any government attempting to move the country decisively toward the European Union. And this is where the drone incidents become particularly significant. Russia does not necessarily need to invade Moldova to destabilize it. It can create uncertainty. It can increase public fear. It can exploit Transnistria. It can apply economic and political pressure. And it can force Moldova to spend more resources defending itself. That is the essence of hybrid warfare. But Transnistria is not what it once was. There is another side to the equation. Transnistria itself is economically vulnerable. The breakaway territory depends heavily on external trade and has increasingly interacted with Moldovan and European markets. Its military position is also complicated. Although Russian-linked forces in the region are often described as numbering roughly 1,500 personnel, Moldovan officials and analysts have questioned how many of those troops are actually Russian contract soldiers. Estimates suggest that only a fraction may be Russian citizens, with others consisting of locally recruited personnel carrying Russian passports. The isolation of the force is another problem. Regular troop rotations have reportedly been extremely difficult for years. That raises questions about the combat effectiveness of the Russian contingent if a major confrontation were ever to occur. And sitting at the center of the entire calculation is the Kobasna ammunition depot. Its enormous stockpile makes the region strategically important, and potentially extremely dangerous. Moldova is preparing. Chisinau, meanwhile, is no longer relying entirely on diplomatic protection. Moldova is increasing military spending. New surveillance and radar capabilities are being introduced. European assistance is helping strengthen the country's ability to monitor its airspace. And legal changes are giving Moldovan authorities greater ability to respond to unauthorized aerial vehicles. The objective is not to defeat Russia in a conventional war. Moldova cannot realistically match Russian military power. The objective is deterrence. The message is: if you enter our airspace, we will see you. And increasingly, if you threaten our territory, we will respond. Romania and Moldova are moving closer. This brings us to one of the most politically sensitive questions in Eastern Europe. Could Romania and Moldova eventually unite? The idea has existed for generations, but recent security developments have given the debate new momentum. Romania has historically maintained strong cultural and political ties with Moldova. Support for unification remains significant in Romanian society, while attitudes inside Moldova are considerably more divided. President Maia Sandu has generally prioritized Moldova's sovereignty and European integration rather than immediate unification. For now, the preferred route remains clear. Moldova wants to strengthen its independence and pursue European Union membership. But geopolitics can change calculations very quickly. If Moldova's European path were seriously blocked, and if Russian pressure continued escalating, unification could return to the center of the strategic debate. For Moscow, that would be an extremely alarming scenario. A union with Romania would effectively place Moldova under the security umbrella of an EU and NATO member. That would dramatically reduce Russia's influence in the region. And that is precisely why the Kremlin has repeatedly portrayed Romanian-Moldovan unification as a Western expansionist project. Germany enters the picture. The Russian drone problem is not limited to the Black Sea. Further west, Germany has also faced serious security concerns involving drones and critical infrastructure. At Leipzig/Halle Airport, a Ukrainian An-124 cargo aircraft was reportedly targeted by an explosive-laden FPV drone. The drone struck an area close to the aircraft's fuel system. The explosive device reportedly failed to detonate and eventually fell to the ground, where it was discovered. That failure may have prevented a catastrophe. But the incident exposed something much larger. A drone does not need to destroy an aircraft to create chaos. It only needs to penetrate a supposedly secure airport. And while the explosive device was being investigated, another aviation incident added to the alarm. A civilian aircraft approaching the airport reportedly encountered an unidentified object and narrowly avoided a potentially dangerous collision. Suddenly, the issue was no longer simply airport security. It was civil aviation. Runways. Aircraft. Passengers. And the possibility that a relatively cheap unmanned system could disrupt one of Europe's most important transportation networks. German authorities consequently began examining whether Russian intelligence services could have been involved. The bigger concern was that Europe might be entering an era in which sabotage can be carried out without conventional military attacks. Turkey's Black Sea warning. Then there is Turkey. Ankara occupies a unique position. It is a NATO member. It controls the Bosporus and Dardanelles. And it has enormous economic interests in Black Sea trade. But Turkish commercial shipping has increasingly found itself exposed to the dangers of the war. Vessels carrying grain and other cargo have been damaged by drones and missiles. Ships connected to Turkey have been caught in dangerous incidents around the Black Sea, including near Novorossiysk. One vessel reportedly suffered a drone explosion that injured members of its Turkish crew. For Ankara, this is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Turkey has spent years trying to balance its relations with Moscow while supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity. But there is a limit to how much risk Ankara can tolerate for its own commercial fleet. That is why Turkey has demonstrated that it can use its control of the straits as a strategic instrument. Commercial shipping movements can be adjusted when security conditions deteriorate. And Turkish officials have continued calling for a ceasefire and greater protection for civilian navigation. The message from Ankara is becoming increasingly direct. The Black Sea cannot be allowed to become a lawless battlefield where commercial vessels are treated as acceptable collateral damage. The threat no one can see. But there is another battlefield that may be even more dangerous. It does not involve missiles. It does not require tanks. And most of the time, it cannot even be seen. It is electronic warfare. Russia has been accused of extensive GPS jamming and spoofing operations across parts of Eastern Europe and the Black Sea region. These systems can interfere with navigation signals used by aircraft and ships. Instead of showing their real positions, aircraft may suddenly appear in completely different locations. Navigation systems can become unreliable. Pilots can be forced to rely on alternative procedures. And commercial aviation can be disrupted without a single missile being fired. That is what makes electronic warfare so dangerous. A government can interfere with another country's infrastructure while remaining below the threshold of conventional armed conflict. And when drones are simultaneously appearing in the same regions, the two forms of warfare can reinforce one another. The drone becomes the visible threat. Electronic warfare becomes the invisible shield behind it. NATO's biggest fear. This leads to perhaps the most dangerous scenario of all. A false flag operation. Imagine a drone strikes NATO infrastructure. But investigators cannot immediately determine who launched it. The weapon looks Ukrainian. The technology appears familiar. Its origin is deliberately obscured. Russia denies involvement. Ukraine denies responsibility. And NATO suddenly faces an impossible question. How do you respond when you cannot prove who attacked you? That ambiguity could be extremely valuable to Moscow. A carefully designed hybrid operation could be intended not necessarily to trigger Article 5, but to test NATO's political cohesion. How quickly would the alliance respond? Would every member agree? Would governments hesitate? Would they argue over attribution? Would uncertainty create division? Those questions are now being taken seriously across NATO's eastern flank. Europe hardens its defenses. Countries bordering Russia and Belarus are increasing protection around critical infrastructure. Lithuania has strengthened security around energy installations. Poland and the Baltic states are protecting strategic facilities and transportation networks. Military forces are being used to secure infrastructure that previously would have been considered primarily a civilian responsibility. Fighter aircraft are maintaining heightened readiness. Air defense systems are becoming more important. And surveillance networks are being expanded. The result is a completely different security environment from the one Europe had before the war. For years, European governments assumed that major conventional war was unlikely. Now the threat is much more complicated. A drone can cross a border. A cyber attack can disable infrastructure. GPS interference can disrupt aviation. A commercial vessel can become a casualty of a military strike. And a single unidentified object can trigger a national security crisis. Russia may have achieved the opposite of what it wanted. There is a strange irony in all of this. Russia's strategy appears designed to intimidate Eastern Europe. But the pressure may be producing the opposite result. Romania is becoming more militarily assertive. Moldova is strengthening its defenses and deepening cooperation with Europe. Turkey is becoming more willing to use its strategic influence over the Black Sea. Germany is treating drone and sabotage threats with greater seriousness. Poland and the Baltic states are reinforcing critical infrastructure. And NATO's eastern members are increasingly coordinating their responses. Instead of isolating these countries from one another, Russian pressure may be pushing them closer together. The question is how far this process will go. The dangerous line ahead. The most dangerous moment may not be a planned Russian attack. It could be an accident. A drone enters the wrong airspace. A fighter intercepts it. A missile is launched. A civilian aircraft is caught nearby. A Russian vessel responds. A NATO aircraft becomes involved. Within minutes, a chain reaction could begin. That is why every new violation matters. The Black Sea is already one of the most heavily contested areas in Europe. Romania is a NATO member. Turkey controls the strategic straits. Moldova sits beside Ukraine and contains the unresolved Transnistrian conflict. The Baltic states are directly exposed to Russia. And Germany is thousands of kilometers away from the battlefield, yet increasingly vulnerable to hybrid attacks. The geography is different. The threat is becoming the same. A new European security era. The old assumption that Russia could provoke European states indefinitely without facing a meaningful response is disappearing. Romania is demonstrating greater willingness to physically neutralize threats. Moldova is building the capacity to defend its airspace. Turkey is signaling that attacks on commercial shipping will have consequences. Germany is investigating the possibility of hostile sabotage operations. And NATO is preparing for a battlefield in which attribution may be deliberately blurred. The era of simply issuing diplomatic protests may be ending. The new era is about detection, interception, deterrence and rapid retaliation. But that creates its own danger. The more aggressively European states respond, the greater the possibility that one incident could escalate beyond anyone's control. So the critical question is no longer whether Russia and Eastern Europe are testing each other's limits. They clearly are. The real question is, who will blink first, and what happens if nobody does? Could Romania's increasingly aggressive response to Russian drones eventually trigger a direct confrontation with Moscow? Could Russia exploit Moldova's vulnerabilities and launch another major drone operation? Could an attack on NATO infrastructure be deliberately designed to create uncertainty over who was responsible? Or could one miscalculation in the Black Sea turn a series of isolated incidents into something far more dangerous? The next move may determine whether Europe is entering a period of stronger deterrence, or sliding toward a confrontation that nobody originally intended. What do you think? Could Romania's decision to physically neutralize Russian drones become the spark for a direct Russian-NATO confrontation? And if Russian drones continue entering Moldovan territory, how far should Chisinau go in defending its airspace? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy following the latest developments in European security, the Black Sea and the wider geopolitical struggle between Russia and the West, make sure you stay with us for the next update. You can also find our content on Spotify for those who prefer listening while traveling or on the move. Thanks for watching.